The 1991 Soviet coup d'etat attempt, also known as the August Putsch or August Coup, was a coup d'etat attempt by a group of members of the Soviet Union's government to take control of the country from Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev. The coup leaders were hardline members of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union who were opposed to Gorbachev's reform program and the new Union treaty that he had negotiated, which decentralized much of the central government's power to the republics. They were opposed mainly in Moscow by a short but effective campaign of civil resistance, although the coup collapsed in only 2 days and Gorbachev returned to government. The event destabilized the Soviet Union and is widely considered to have contributed to both the demise of the CPSU and the dissolution of the Soviet Union. After the capitulation of the State Committee on the State of Emergency, popularly referred to as the Gang of Eight, both the Supreme Court of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic and the President of the USSR Mikhail Gorbachev described their actions as a coup attempt. Background: since assuming power in 1985, Gorbachev had embarked on an ambitious program of reform, embodied in the twin concepts of perestroika and glasnost, meaning economic, political restructuring and openness, respectively. These moves prompted resistance and suspicion on the part of hardline members of the nomenklatura. The reforms also unleashed some forces and movements that Gorbachev did not expect. Specifically, nationalist agitation on the part of the Soviet Union's non-Russian minorities grew, and there were fears that some or all of the Union republics might secede. In 1991, the Soviet Union was in a severe economic and political crisis. There were shortages of almost all products, and people had to stand in long lines to buy even essential goods. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Georgia had already declared their independence from the Soviet Union. In January 1991, there was an attempt to return Lithuania to the Soviet Union by force. About a week later, there was a similar attempt by local pro-Soviet forces to overthrow the Latvian authorities. There were continuing armed ethnic conflicts in Nagorno-Karabakh and South Ossetia. Russia declared its sovereignty on the 12th of June 1990 and thereafter limited the application of Soviet laws, in particular the laws concerning finance and the economy, on Russian territory. The Supreme Soviet of the Russian SFSR adopted laws which contradicted Soviet laws. In the Unified referendum on the 17th of March 1991, boycotted by the Baltic states, Armenia, Georgia, and Moldova, the majority of the residents of the rest of the republics expressed the desire to retain the renewed Soviet Union. Following negotiations, 8 of the 9 republics approved the new Union Treaty with some conditions. The treaty would make the Soviet Union a federation of independent republics with a common president, foreign policy, and military. Russia, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan were to sign the treaty in Moscow on the 20th of August 1991. Preparation. On the 11th of December 1990, KGB Chairman Vladimir Khrushchev made a call for order over Central Television in Moscow. That day, he asked 2 KGB officers to prepare a plan of measures that could be taken in case a state of emergency was declared in the USSR. Later, Khrushchev brought Soviet Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov, Internal Affairs Minister Boris Pugard, Premier Valentin Pavlov, Vice President Gennady Yanev, Soviet Defense Council Deputy Chief Oleg Baklanov, Gorbachev Secretariat Head Valery Bolton, and CPSU Central Committee Secretary Oleg Shenin into the conspiracy. The members of the Gk Chp hoped that Gorbachev could be persuaded to declare the state of emergency and to restore order. On the 23rd of July 1991, A number of party functionaries and literati published in the hardline newspaper Sovetskaya Rossiya as a prime factor to an anti-perestroika manifesto entitled A Word to the People. 6 days later, Gorbachev, Russian President Boris Yeltsin and Kazakh President Nursultan Nazarbayev discussed the possibility of replacing such hardliners as Pavlov, Jazov, Khrushchev and Pugo with more liberal figures. Khrushchev, who had placed Gorbachev under close surveillance as Subject 110 several months earlier, eventually got wind of the conversation. On the 4th of August, Gorbachev went on holiday to his dacha in Foros, Crimea. He planned to return to Moscow in time for the new Union Treaty signing on the 20th of August. On the 17th of August, the members of the Gk Chp met at a KGB guest house in Moscow and studied the treaty document. They believed the pact would pave the way to the Soviet Union's breakup, and decided that it was time to act. The next day, Baklanov, Boldin, Shenin, and USSR Deputy Defense Minister General Valentin Varenikov flew to Crimea for a meeting with Gorbachev. They demanded that Gorbachev either declare a state of emergency or resign and name Yanayev as acting president to allow the members of the Gk Chp to restore order in the country. Gorbachev has always claimed that he refused point-blank to accept the ultimatum. Varenikov has insisted that Gorbachev said, "Damn you, do what you want, but report my opinion." Quote. However, those present at the dacha at the time testified that Baklanov, Boldin, Shenin, and Varenikov had been clearly disappointed and nervous after the meeting with Gorbachev. With Gorbachev's refusal, the conspirators ordered that he remain confined to the Forest dacha. At the same time, the dacha's communication lines were shut down. Additional KGB security guards were placed at the dacha gates with orders to stop anybody from leaving. The members of the Gk Chp ordered 250,000 pairs of handcuffs from a factory in PSKV to be sent to Moscow and 300,000 arrest forms. Khrushchev doubled the pay of all KGB personnel, called them back from holiday, and placed them on alert. The Lefortovo prison was emptied to receive prisoners. The August Coup. The members of the Gk Chp met in the Kremlin after Baklanov, Boldin, Shenin and Varenikov returned from the Crimea. Yanayev, Pavlov and Baklanov signed the so-called Declaration of the Soviet Leadership, in which they declared the state of emergency in all of the USSR, and announced that the State Committee of the State of Emergency had been created to manage the country and to effectively maintain the regime of the state of emergency. The Gk Chp included the following members: Gennady Yanayev, Valentin Pavlov, Vladimir Khrushchev, Dmitry Yazov, Boris Pugo, Oleg Baklanov, Vasily Starodubtsev, chairman of the USSR Peasant Union, Alexander Dissolution, president of the Association of the State Enterprises and Objects of Industry, Transport and Communications of the USSR. Yanayev signed the decree naming himself as acting USSR president on the pretext of Gorbachev's inability to perform presidential duties due to illness. These eight collectively became known as the Gang of Eight. The Gk Chp banned all newspapers in Moscow, except for 9 party-controlled newspapers. The Gk Chp also issued a populist declaration which stated that the honor and dignity of a Soviet man must be restored. The 19th of August, all of the State Committee on the State of Emergency documents were broadcast over the state radio and television starting from 7 a.m. The Russian SFSR-controlled Radio Rossi and Televidenie Rossi, plus Echo Moskvy, the only independent political radio station, were cut off the air. Armor units of the Tamanskaya Division and the Kantaمیrovskaya Tank Division rolled into Moscow along with paratroops. 4 Russian SFSR People's Deputies were detained by the KGB at an army base near Moscow. The conspirators considered detaining Russian SFSR President Boris Yeltsin upon his arrival from a visit to Kazakhstan on the 17th of August, or after that when he was at his dacha near Moscow, but for some reason they did not do so. The failure to arrest Yeltsin was to prove fatal to the plans. Yeltsin arrived at the White House, Russia's parliament building, at 9 a.m. on the 19th of August, together with Russian SFSR Prime Minister Ivan Silayev and Supreme Soviet Chairman Ruslan Khasbulatov. Yeltsin issued a declaration in which it was stated that a reactionary anti-constitutional coup had taken place. The military was urged not to take part in the coup. The declaration called for a general strike with the demand to let Mikhail Gorbachev address the people. This declaration was distributed around Moscow in the form of flyers. In the afternoon, the citizens of Moscow began to gather around the White House and to erect barricades around it. In response, Gennady Yanayev declared the state of emergency in Moscow at 1600. Yanayev declared at the press conference at 1700 that Gorbachev was resting. He said, over these years he has got very tired and needs some time to get his health back. Meanwhile, Major Evdokimov, Chief of Staff of a tank battalion of the Tamanskaya Division guarding the White House, declared his loyalty to the leadership of the Russian SFSR. Yeltsin climbed one of the tanks and addressed the crowd. Unexpectedly, this episode was included in the state media's evening news. The 20th of August at noon, Moscow Military District Commander General Kalinin, whom Yanayev appointed as military commandant of Moscow, declared a curfew in Moscow from 2300 to 5 o'clock, effective from the 20th of August. This was understood as the sign that the attack on the White House was imminent. The defenders of the White House prepared themselves, most of them being unarmed. Evdokimov's tanks were moved from the White House in the evening. The makeshift White House Defense Headquarters was headed by General Konstantin Kobits, a Russian SFSR People's Deputy. In the afternoon, Khrushchev, Jazov and Pugo finally decided to attack the White House. This decision was supported by other Gk Chp members. Khrushchev and Yazov's deputies, KGB General Agueyev and Army General Akolov, respectively, planned the assault codenamed Operation Grom, which would gather elements of the Alpha and Vympel elite special force units, with the support of the paratroopers, Moscow OMON, the internal troops of the Dzержinski Division, 3 tank companies and a helicopter squadron. Alpha Group Commander General Viktor Karpagin and other senior officers of the unit, together with Airborne Troops Deputy Commander Gen. Alexander Lebed, mingled with the crowds near the White House and assessed the possibility of such an operation. After that, Karpagin and Vympel Commander Colonel Bustov tried to convince Agueyev that the operation would result in bloodshed and should be cancelled. Lebed, with the consent of his immediate superior, Pavel Grachev, returned to the White House and secretly informed the defense headquarters that the attack would begin at 2 o'clock. Estonia's Supreme Council declared Republic of Estonia sovereign and independent at 23.03. The 21st of August, at about 1 o'clock, not far from the White House, trolleybuses and street cleaning machines barricaded a tunnel against oncoming Tamin Guards infantry fighting vehicles. 3 men were killed in the incident with several others wounded. 2 of the victims were trying to cover an IFV's observation slit. The crowd later burned the IFV, but no soldiers were killed. Alpha Group and Vympel did not move to the White House as had been planned, and Yazov ordered the troops to pull out from Moscow. The troops began to move from Moscow at 8 o'clock. The Gk Chp members met in the Defense Ministry and, not knowing what to do, decided to send Khrushchev, Yazov Baklanov, Dissykov, Anatoly Lukyanov, and Deputy CPSU General Secretary Vladimir Ivashko to the Crimea to meet Gorbachev, who refused to meet them when they arrived. With the Dacha's communications to Moscow restored, Gorbachev declared all the Gk Chp's decisions void and dismissed its members from the state offices. The USSR General Prosecutor's Office started the investigation of the coup. During that period, the Supreme Council Republic of Latvia declared its sovereignty officially completed. Aftermath: Gorbachev and the Gk Chp delegation flew to Moscow, where Khrushchev, Yazov, and Dissykov were arrested upon arrival in the early hours of the 22nd of August. Pugo committed suicide along with his wife the next day. Pavlov, Vasily Starodubtsev, Baklanov, Bolden, and Shenin would be in custody within the next 48 hours. Since several heads of the regional executive committees supported the Gk Chp, on the 21st of August the Supreme Soviet of the Russian SFSR adopted Decision Number 1626-1, which authorized Russian President Boris Yeltsin to appoint heads of regional administrations. Although the Russian constitution did not empower the president with such authority, it passed another decision the next day which declared the old imperial colors as Russia's national flag. It eventually replaced the Russian SFSR flag 2 months later. On the night of the 24th of August, the Felix Dzerzhinsky statue in front of the KGB building at Dzerzhinsky Square was dismantled, while thousands of Moscow citizens took part in the funeral of Dmitry Kamar, Vladimir Usov, and Ilya Krychevsky, the 3 citizens who died in the tunnel incident. Gorbachev posthumously awarded them with the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Yeltsin asked the relatives to forgive him for not being able to prevent their deaths. End of the CPSU. Gorbachev resigned as CPSU General Secretary on the 24th of August. Vladimir Ivashko replaced him as acting General Secretary but resigned on the 29th of August. Around the same time, Yeltsin decreed the transfer of the CPSU archives to the state archive authorities, as well as nationalizing all CPSU assets in Russia. Yeltsin decreed the termination and banning of all party activities in Russia. Dissolution of the Soviet Union on the 24th of August. Mikhail Gorbachev created the so-called Committee for the Operational Management of the Soviet Economy, to replace the USSR Cabinet of Ministers headed by Valentin Pavlov, a Gk Chp member. Russian Prime Minister Ivan Silayev headed this committee. On the same day, the Verkhovna Rada adopted the Declaration of Independence of Ukraine and called for a referendum on support of the Declaration of Independence. The Byelorussian Soviet Socialist Republic, the third powerful republic in the Union, also declared its independence the next day on the 25th of August, which then established the Republic of Belarus. On the 5th of September, the Congress of People's Deputies of the Soviet Union adopted Soviet Law No. 2392-1 on the authorities of the Soviet Union in the transitional period, under which the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union had replaced Congress of People's Deputies and was reformed. 2 new legislative chambers, the Soviet of the Union and the Soviet of Republics, replaced the Soviet of the Union and the Soviet of Nationalities. The Soviet of the Union was to be formed by the popularly elected USSR People's Deputies. The Soviet of Republics was to include 20 deputies from each Union Republic plus 1 deputy to represent each autonomous region of each Union Republic delegated by the legislatures of the Union Republic. Russia was an exception with 52 deputies. However, the delegation of each Union Republic was to have only one vote in the Soviet of Republics. The laws were to be first adopted by the Soviet of the Union and then by the Soviet of Republics. Also created was the USSR State Council, which included the USSR President and the Presidents of Union Republics. The Committee for the Operational Management of the Soviet Economy was replaced by the USSR Inter-Republican Economic Committee, also headed by Ivan Silayev. On the 27th of August, the first state became independent. Supreme Soviet of Moldova declared the independence of Moldova from the Soviet Union. The Supreme Soviets of Azerbaijan and Kyrgyzstan did the same on 30 and the 31st of August respectively. Afterwards, on the 6th of September, the newly created Soviet State Council recognized the independence of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. Estonia had declared re-independence on the 20th of August, Latvia on the following day, while Lithuania had done so already on the 11th of March 1990. 3 days later, on the 9th of September, the Supreme Soviet of Tajikistan declared the independence of Tajikistan from the Soviet Union. Furthermore, in September, over 99% of voters in Armenia voted for a referendum approving the republic's commitment to independence. The immediate aftermath of that vote was the Armenian Supreme Soviet's Declaration of Independence, issued on the 21st of September. By the 27th of October, the Supreme Soviet of Turkmenistan declared the independence of Turkmenistan from the Soviet Union. On the 1 of December, Ukraine held a referendum in which more than 90% of residents supported the act of independence of Ukraine. By November, the only Soviet republics that had not declared independence were Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. That same month, 7 republics agreed to a new union treaty that would form a confederation called the Union of Sovereign States. However, this confederation never materialized. On the 8th of December, Boris Yeltsin, Leonid Kravchuk and Stanislav Shushkevich, respectively leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, as well as the prime ministers of the republics, met in Minsk, the capital of Belarus, where they created the Commonwealth of Independent States and annulled the 1922 Union Treaty that had established the Soviet Union. Doubts remained about the legitimacy of the signing that took place on the 8th of December. So another signing ceremony was held in Alma-Ata on the 21st of December to expand the CIS to include Armenia, Azerbaijan and the 5 republics of Central Asia. Georgia joined in 1993, only to withdraw in 2008 after conflict between Georgia and Russia. The 3 Baltic states never joined. On the 24th of December 1991, the Russian Federation, with the concurrence of the other republics of the Commonwealth of Independent States, informed the United Nations that it would succeed the Soviet Union in its membership in the UN and in its seat on the United Nations Security Council. No member state of the UN formally objected to this step. The legitimacy of this act has been questioned by some legal scholars, as the Soviet Union itself was not constitutionally succeeded by the Russian Federation, but merely dissolved. Others argued that the international community had already established the precedent of recognizing the Soviet Union as the legal successor of the Russian Empire, and so recognizing the Russian Federation as the Soviet Union's successor state was valid. After Russia's succession, on the 25th of December 1991, Gorbachev announced his resignation as Soviet president. The red hammer and sickle flag of the Soviet Union was lowered from the Senate building in the Kremlin and replaced with the tricolor flag of Russia. The largest republic, the Russian SFSR, was renamed to the Russian Federation. The next day, the 26th of December 1991, the Soviet Union officially divided into 15 individual sovereign states, thus ending the existence of the world's first and oldest socialist state. All former Soviet embassies became Russian embassies, while Russia received the nuclear weapons from the other former republics. A constitutional crisis occurred in 1993, had been escalated into violence, and the new constitution adopted officially abolished the entire Soviet government. Beginning of radical economic reforms in Russia. On 1 November 1991, the RSFSR Congress of People's Deputies issued Decision No. 1831-1 on the legal support of the economic reform, whereby the Russian president was granted the right to issue decrees required for the economic reform even if they contravened the laws. Such decrees entered into force if they were not repealed within 7 days by the Supreme Soviet of the Russian SFSR or its Presidium. 5 days later, Boris Yeltsin, in addition to the duties of the president, assumed the duties of the prime minister. Yegor Gaidar became deputy prime minister and simultaneously economic and finance minister. On November 15, 1991, Boris Yeltsin issued Decree No. 213 on the liberalization of foreign economic activity on the territory of the RSFSR, whereby all Russian companies were allowed to import and to export goods and to acquire foreign currency. Following the issuing of Decree No. 213, on 3 December 1991, Boris Yeltsin issued Decree No. 297 on the measures to liberalize prices, whereby from 2 January 1992 most previously existing price controls were abolished. Trial of the members of the Gk Chp. The Gk Chp members and their accomplices were charged with treason in the form of a conspiracy aimed at capturing power. However, by the end of 1992 they were all released from custody pending trial. The trial in the military chamber of the Russian Supreme Court began on 14 April 1993. On 23 February 1994, the State Duma declared amnesty for all Gk Chp members and their accomplices, along with the participants of the October 1993 crisis. They all accepted the amnesty, except for General Varenikov, who demanded the continuation of the trial and was finally acquitted on the 11th of August 1994. Parliamentary Commission. In 1991, the Parliamentary Commission for investigating causes and reasons of the coup attempt was established under Lev Ponomarev, but in 1992 it was dissolved at Ruslan Khasbulatov's insistence. Further fate of Gk Chp members. Gennady Yanev, amnesty of the Russian State Duma of 1994, headed the Department of History and International Relations for the Russian International Academy of Tourism, died in 2010. Valentin Pavlov, amnesty of the Russian State Duma of 1994, died in 2003. Vladimir Kryuchkov, amnesty of the Russian State Duma of 1994, died in 2007. Dmitry Yazov, amnesty of the Russian State Duma of 1994. Boris Pugard committed suicide on August 22, 1991. Oleg Baklanov, amnesty of the Russian State Duma of 1994, chairman of Board of Directors for Rososhemash. Vasily Starodubtsev, freed from arrest in 1992 due to health complications, died in 2011. Alexander Dissykov, amnesty of the Russian State Duma of 1994. Severnaya Kazna, Vidicon, Fidelity.